Hi, I'm Sarah Lindblom. I have a CSA farm outside of Buffalo, Minnesota here where I grow produce, herbs, and also raise a poultry flock for eggs. I'm also a soil health educator with the Sustainable Farming Association. And today we're going to talk a little bit about soil health, but more specifically, how we can diagnose our soil health using some simple at-home tests that will give us a more well-rounded understanding of our soil's profile. We're going to talk a little bit about soil health, but more specifically, how we can do some simple at-home diagnostics that will help give us a more well-rounded understanding of our soil, specifically the physical, chemical, and biological components. So first of all, what is soil health? A very basic definition of soil health is the ability for soil to function. So for soil to be able to cycle nutrients, for soil to just promote an environment that has great plant health. When we're talking about soil health, what can we do to preserve that environment, that ecosystem? We can use something called the soil health principles, which are outlined very briefly in the beginning of this informational toolkit of directions on how to do the soil health tests. When we get down to it, the core of the soil health principles is really just to reduce disruption to the soil, whether it be physical or chemical. And today with these 4 diagnostic tests, we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when we disrupt or don't disrupt the soil and what the benefits of those different uses of the soil health principles can be. All right, so the first test we're going to talk about today is called the Infiltration Test. And this is a test that shows what happens when we get a 1-inch rain event. The materials that you need for this test are some sort of cylinder. I have a soup can with both ends cut off, or you can use a piece of PVC or any other type of cylinder you have available. Some sort of measuring device that measures milliliters, a timer or some sort of stopwatch, or you can always just count Mississippis. And then your soil location that you're going to sample. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to be using this tub of soil. And then you'll want to also have handy your soil health report card so that you can record the data that you collect during this test. All right, so to do the infiltration test, you take your cylinder, and as you can see, I've marked a line all the way around that marks 3 inches deep. So you'll take your cylinder out to your location in your garden or your field or your yard, wherever you're doing this soil test, and push the cylinder down 3 inches into that soil sample. And make sure for your records to take note of that location. I'm going to just push it in with my hand today for this demonstration, but at home you might need to put a board over the top of this and then hammer it in with a mallet to actually be able to get it into the ground. So I'm going to push that down as close to 3 inches as I can get, and then I'm just going to use my fingers to kind of press the soil down on the inside just to get a nice flat surface on the inside there. So next, once you've got your cylinder inserted into the ground where you're going to take your measurement, I have a measuring device where I've calculated the milliliters that would take up 1 inch of my cylinder. And with a soup can, that's actually 125 milliliters of water, but the soil health test kit has directions on how to calculate that amount of water if you're using a different size cylinder. Okay, so next you're gonna pour your water that you've measured into your cylinder, and once you do that, you'll wanna count how long it takes for that to infiltrate in seconds. And you may wanna use a stopwatch to get a more accurate reading of this, or you can just count to Mississippi to see about how long that takes. All right, I'm gonna pour in my measured amount of water and see what happens. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. All right, so this sample only took about 5 seconds to infiltrate, which is fairly quick. It can take sometimes up to more like an hour even, depending on your soil structure. So the next thing you'll want to do is record this data in your report card. So there's a section for the date, the vessel and the milliliters of water, your location, and then the first pour seconds. So after you do that test and get the number of seconds that it takes for the soil or the water to infiltrate into the soil, you'll just record that in your report card. The date, the vessel and milliliters of water, in this case was a soup can and 125 milliliters. The location in your yard, your garden, or your farm. The first pour seconds, so here this was 5 seconds. And then what you'll want to do after about 6 hours is come back and repeat this test and record the number of seconds it takes for a second pour in the exact same location. All right, so what can we learn from the soil infiltration test that we just did? Well, first of all, this is a great test to learn about our soil structure. If the soil infiltrates really quickly, we probably have a more sandy soil that the water is able to be absorbed quite quickly. If we have a heavier or more compacted soil, it will probably take quite a bit longer for the water to actually be infiltrated into the soil. And this means we might need to do things to help improve that soil structure. And again, all of the information is creating a data set. So we're not necessarily comparing or going for a certain time. We're really just collecting data that we can use to then compare over time when we repeat this soil health test, maybe a year or a couple of years down the road, as we implement some different strategies to help improve our soil structure and overall soil health. All right, so the next test that we're going to talk about today is called the Slake Test. And this is another test that shows what happens to our soil during a heavy rain event. So what I'm going to do here is actually do a side-by-side comparison of two different soil samples, but at home you may only have one sample to compare, or maybe you want to take two samples. For example, one from your yard or your garden where you've used tillage or you've used herbicide, and then maybe another area where you haven't used any herbicide, where the soil's been completely undisrupted, and that will give you a good side-by-side comparison in your own yard. So we're using this test to create, again, a baseline comparison for your soil now and at some point in the future when you've used different soil health principles to improve your soil. So the first step to the Slake test is to collect your soil samples. And what we're looking for is a clod of dirt, which is something like this. It's just a nice clump of dirt. And this is a good opportunity to use your observational skills to assess your soil health. You can look at the texture, the color, even the scent of your soil. And a good clod will hold together like you see here. That's called aggregate, but it will also crumble a bit under pressure. It won't just be like a piece of concrete that can't be crumbled at all. So once you collect your clod, the important thing is to make sure your clod is completely dried out before you do this actual Slake test. Sometimes I'll set this in front of, like a nice fireplace like we have here to dry that out good, or a heat vent or a fan, but just make sure it's completely dried out before you do that Slake test. So then some of the materials that you need to actually do the Slake test are some mason jars like this. And then I've created these baskets made out of hardware cloth that comes in a roll from the hardware store, and just using a pliers to form this nice basket that fits perfectly into my mason jar. Now these are great for demonstration purposes, but if you don't have this at home, you can even just use a plastic bottle out of your recycling like I've made here. Cut the top off and just invert that down inside of your plastic bottle and tape around the edge, or use like a paper clip just to secure that so that this doesn't go floating away when you actually fill this up with water. And then you'll want to fill this up with water just like I have these mason jars here. All right, so the next step once we've collected our soil samples is to actually submerge them in the water and see what happens when that soil is exposed to a heavy rain event. And like I mentioned, I have two different samples here. They're both from very similar soil types in fields that are right next to each other. The only difference is the management style of how these two farm fields have been treated. The first sample uses no tillage, no chemicals, and what we would call low disruption and high crop or high plant diversity, different types of plants and vegetation in the soil. The second sample here is high tillage, use of herbicides and fertilizer, synthetic fertilizers, and what we would call high disruption and low diversity. So I'm going to move these out of the way so we can see what happens when we submerge both of these soil samples into the water. When we observe the differences between these two soil samples, we can see that the low disruption sample, sample number 1, is able to absorb more of the moisture and keep its soil structure a little bit better than the sample that has a higher level of disruption. We can also see a difference in the clarity of the water quality. So if we have a sample of soil with higher disruption, more chemical and physical disturbances, that water is more liable to wash away and erode into our lakes and streams. We also know that a sample that's able to absorb more moisture will be able to hold that moisture down the road for a drought event, for example, whereas the moisture in this sample will not be there down the road when the plants still need it when we're not getting any rain. So how can we record this data in our soil health report card? Well, again, we want to make sure to get the date that we actually collected the sample and then the date that we actually did the test, because remember, we need to let that sample dry out in between when we actually do the test. You'll want to make sure to include the sample location. And then if you're able to take a picture of your results, that's a great way to capture that data for future reference. If you're not able to get a picture of that, we can actually use a table to assess the stability class and assign a number to that soil sample. Everywhere from 0 soil too unstable to sample, so we can't even get a good clod of soil to be able to do the sample, all the way to a 6, 100% of soil remaining on the sieve after 5 dipping cycles. And the dipping cycle just means that we can raise and lower this to see what happens. So again, the sample number 1 even has quite a bit of room for improvement, because after 1 dipping cycle, we still lost our structural integrity after, or I should say, that would be a stability class of number 2, that we lost our structural integrity after 5 to 30 seconds of insertion of water, or maybe a 3. Well, you can use the table yourself to assess the stability class, and then just record that in your table along with a picture if you do have that. And then down the road, when you repeat this test, you'll be able to compare if you've had an improvement in the stability class. So far we've done 2 soil tests that gave us a good idea of our soil structure. But next we're going to take a look at a test that tells us a little bit more about the chemical properties of our soil, which is the pH test. So the materials you need for the pH test are your soil sample, your buffer solutions, a pH meter, and some distilled water. And there is an alternate method that you would need vinegar and baking soda for that alternate method if you don't have the pH meter and the pH buffer solutions at home. The first thing we're going to do is add some distilled water to our soil sample. And it's important to use distilled water versus tap water just to make sure that you're not getting any sort of inaccuracies in your actual pH reading. So the distilled water is going to have a totally neutral pH and won't affect our reading. And we want to do about 1 part water to 2 parts water to 1 part soil. Give or take, it doesn't need to be perfectly accurate. And then we're just gonna stir this up a little bit. And once we stir it up, we'll just kind of let that soil sample settle a little bit. You just wanna make sure you have enough of this slurry mixture so that when you insert the probe of your pH meter, it can be completely submerged. We'll start with our pH 7 buffer solution. So I'm going to just pour that into my cup here, just enough to submerge the probe. And then I'm going to insert the pH meter in that solution and just let it settle a little bit, and just use this little screw that was included to make sure we're at 7. Close as possible. Close enough. So then I'm just going to rinse off my pH meter here in some water in between. And next we're going to calibrate this with the buffer solution that has a pH of 4. And these solutions are just, again, helping us make sure that we're getting as accurate of a reading as possible on our pH meter. So we want this to be at about 4. All right. So now that this has settled a little bit, our soil sample, I'm going to insert the probe into the sample and take a reading of our pH of the soil. And we want to give that a few moments just so the meter settles a little bit. And I've included in the directions in the report card a range of pHs that we're looking for ideal plant growth. And certain crops require different pHs, and you can look that up usually online for the specific crop you're trying to grow. So it looks like we've stabilized right around 6.1, which is within the healthy range, going up a little bit. 6.8 to 7.5 is nearly neutral, but 6 to 7.5 is acceptable for most plant growth. So for this sample, we shouldn't have any problems with the actual soil pH. If you don't have a pH meter at home, there's an alternate method that uses baking soda and vinegar. And for that method, you're going to collect your soil sample and simply divide that into 2 separate containers and create your slurry with the distilled water. But this time, instead of using a pH meter, you will put about a half cup of vinegar into one of those cups, and then about a half cup of baking soda into the other cup. And you're gonna observe if one or the other has a reaction. If there's no reaction, that's an indication that you have probably about a neutral soil. And you can look at the instructions here, but if it fizzes when you combine it with the vinegar, your soil probably has an acidic pH. So again, you can review that details of that in the directions to assess those results with the vinegar baking soda method. So far we've talked about physical structure and chemical properties of our soil health, but how do we assess the biological activity of our soil? Well, one way to do that is the third test in the soil health toolkit, which is the earthworm test. And to do this test, you simply need a tarp and a shovel and maybe some sort of, I used a bucket lid just to create a stencil to keep a consistent size hole. So you want to dig a hole around your bucket lid and about 1 foot deep. And as you're digging that hole, make sure to put all of the soil onto the tarp and then go through and count all of the earthworms that you can find in that soil sample. And it's good to do this test in the spring or the fall when earthworms tend to be the most active. And you're looking for about 30 earthworms per square foot is a good measure, but again, we're just creating some baseline data to record in the report card that you can then compare from year to year to see if you have any improvement in biological activity in your soil. Well, those are the 4 soil health tests that I wanted to talk about today for you to start getting a little bit more understanding of your soil. The soil is such a fascinating subject. 1 teaspoon of soil has more microbes in it than there are humans on the planet Earth. So it's really important to maintain that ecosystem of our soil underfoot. We're really just starting to understand what's going on in this ecosystem and why it's so important. And if you're looking to garden, if you're looking to grow crops or farm, or just be a steward of the land, it really starts with getting this more in-depth understanding of your soil health. And then you can go from there to know what types of improvements that you can make to just help out those soil microbes, those insects, all the way up to the plants and even human health. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about some simple at-home tests that you can do to get started growing and gardening.